Sarah had it all: Ethan's love and a secret affair with Daniel. But when her pregnancy exposed her manipulations, her perfect world crumbled. Ethan, upon discovering the truth, declared, "I won't be part of this game anymore." Left alone with a paternity test in hand, Sarah's future hung in the balance. Will she win him back, or choose a new path? Find out how betrayal turns against those who play dangerous games. The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound breaking it was the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Ethan sat on the couch, his gaze empty, holding his breath as he stared at the flash drive lying before him. It contained her messages. Messages he found in her bag when he stayed home after yet another meeting with friends. Was it true? Or was it just his imagination playing tricks on him? He clutched the flash drive in his hand, unsure of what to do. Every next step could change everything. But was he ready to uncover the whole truth? Minutes passed before he stood up, grabbed the flash drive, and plugged it into the computer. A list of messages appeared on the screen. Ethan felt his heart start to race. With each line he read, his suspicions turned into reality. "Daniel, I can't live like this anymore. It's because he'll never be like you." "Is it her?" he thought, the feeling of betrayal hitting him like a sharp blow to the chest. But before he could read all the messages, she appeared in the doorway. Sarah, his wife, smiling and surprised. "What are you doing, honey? Did something happen?" Her voice was so lively it made his heart skip a beat. He couldn't believe she still looked the same as before. Ethan cast a quick glance at the flash drive and closed the computer, trying not to show his emotions. "Nothing special," he said, masking his feelings. I just wish everything could be like it used to be." Sarah walked over to him and kissed him on the cheek. "It will be fine, trust me. We're as solid as ever," she said. Ethan felt it hard to breathe, but didn't reply. One thought kept swirling in his head. What do I do next? This was just the beginning. Sarah didn't know that he already knew. She didn't suspect that he was teetering on the edge of a great drama she could never imagine. But he had already decided. She would have a chance to tell him the truth, and if she didn't, he would find it out himself. In the meantime, Ethan tried to restore normalcy in their relationship, even if it was difficult. He started spending more time with Sarah, trying to hide his suspicions. But deep down, he knew his life would never be the same again. All those small signs, all those changes in her behavior, he could no longer ignore them. Sarah went to meetings, occasionally looking tense, becoming more withdrawn. She no longer shared her thoughts and feelings with him as she used to. Yet despite this, he tried to convince himself it was just a temporary crisis. Maybe she was just tired. But one night changed everything. When Sarah left for another business trip, Ethan decided to take matters into his own hands. He plugged the flash drive into the computer again, hoping this time he would find answers to all his questions. And then, after reading a few more messages from Daniel, he stumbled upon something that made his heart stop. "I want to be with you so badly, but I can't. He trusts me too much." At that moment, he knew for sure. The betrayal was real. But was he ready to know everything, even if it meant losing everything he had? Ethan sat on the couch, his gaze fixed on the computer screen. His hands still trembled as he clutched the flash drive, unraveling its contents. The messages he saw confirmed his suspicions. It was her, Sarah, his wife, writing to another man. Was she ever truly loyal to him? Or was it all just an illusion? "Daniel, I can't live like this anymore," was one of the last messages he read, and it tore at his heart. Ethan didn't want to believe what he was seeing, but he couldn't close his eyes to reality any longer. Meanwhile, Sarah returned home earlier than usual. She carried a bag in her hand, looking tired, but trying to appear normal, as always. "Hi, honey. How are you?" Her voice sounded pleasant, but Ethan felt every word echo painfully in his heart. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just looked at her with a gaze that made her stop in her tracks. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, noticing the change in his expression. Ethan stood, staring at her. "Sarah, I found your messages. You betrayed me. You and Daniel." A heavy silence filled the air. She tried to say something, but the words caught in her throat. "It's not what you think," she blurted out, flustered and confused. Not what I think. His voice was cold, devoid of emotion. You mean to tell me you're not cheating on me? You want me to believe it's just a coincidence that I found your messages? Sarah remained silent, realizing that her excuses no longer held any weight. I know everything, Ethan continued, his voice growing harsher. And now you have to decide what to do about it. I can't live like this. I deserve the truth. Sarah lowered her eyes, her skin turning pale, and her heart pounding faster. She knew everything was now on the brink. I don't know how it happened. Ethan shook his head. We can't be together anymore, Sarah. You've betrayed my trust, and I can't go back to what we had. He walked away, leaving her alone in the silence, her face etched with sorrow and regret. This was only the first part of Ethan's uncovering of the truth, but it marked the beginning of what would become a difficult and painful journey of revenge and separation. Sarah realized her choices had been fatal, but she lacked the strength to turn back. But would this journey be final for Ethan? Would he stay with his wife, or move on to a new chapter of life? These questions remained unanswered, and what would happen next depended on whether he could endure the pain or leave it all behind. Ethan sat in the kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee growing cold on the table. His thoughts were consumed with pain and disappointment, but deep down, he couldn't fully let go of Sarah. It was like fighting with himself. He knew she had betrayed him, but his love for her hadn't left. He remembered the times they laughed together, sharing all the joys of life. His heart ached at the thought that it could all end because of one mistake. Yet now, he understood he couldn't simply let her go. Another part of him was stubborn. He wanted to give her a chance, even though he knew it might bring him even greater pain. He couldn't just forget her, even after learning the whole truth. Sarah returned home from work, and Ethan waited for her on the couch. Every glance, every gesture. She tried to hide her guilt, but he could see it. She was different. She no longer laughed or talked to him about the little things as she used to. It was as if she were in another world. Are you home? Sarah asked as she entered the room, trying to appear normal, but Ethan noticed how empty her eyes had become. Yes, I'm here, he replied calmly, without looking at her but feeling his heart tighten. We need to talk. Sarah sat on the edge of the couch, her eyes filled with worry. I know you're upset, Ethan. You betrayed me. His voice was quiet but firm. And now we need to figure out if there's still something between us. Sarah sighed and lifted her gaze to meet his eyes. She felt his pain piercing through her, and though her heart was full of regret, she understood that her choice was indefensible. I made a mistake. I was weak, but I love you, Ethan. You're the only one for me. Ethan looked at her, and though his soul was in agony, he couldn't deny her. Something in her words touched his heart, and he felt that he wasn't ready to let go of this part of his life just yet. I'll give you a chance, he said, though deep down he understood this might lead to even more pain. But if you betray me again, I won't survive it. Sarah raised her hands as if ready to promise him everything he wanted to hear. I promise I won't be like that anymore. I want to be with you, and only you. Over the next few days, they tried to return to normal life. Sarah became more cautious with her actions, but her behavior grew increasingly strange. She started coming home late, her phone was always on silent, and she often averted her gaze for no reason. Ethan couldn't help but notice. He began to feel that she was hiding something. You've been coming home late a lot, he said one day, trying to keep the conversation neutral. What's going on, Sarah? Sarah hesitated. She couldn't tell him the truth and didn't want to admit that she was still communicating with Daniel. She knew it was deceitful but wasn't ready to end her relationship with him. She feared that if she told Ethan everything, she would lose him forever. Just a lot of work, you know? She dodged the question, but Ethan no longer believed her words. Every bit of her behavior triggered new suspicions. He could no longer be blind to it, and his inner voice told him she was hiding something again. So one evening, when Sarah left once more, Ethan decided to act. He began searching through her things, hoping to find some clues. And then, as he opened her bag, he found something that shattered everything. In the pocket of her bag was a hotel card with the name Daniel, the same man she had cheated on him with before. It was all he needed to confirm. She was still involved with him. When Sarah returned home, He didn't hold back. He couldn't remain silent anymore. I know about your meetings with Daniel. His voice was calm but filled with anger. You lied to me again. Sarah flinched, her face turning pale. She had been caught red-handed. Ethan, I don't know what to say. I'm scared of losing you, but I can't stop seeing him. It's complicated. Yes, it's complicated, he almost shouted. But why can't you just be honest with me? Why can't you own up to your mistakes and make the right choice? Sarah remained silent. She couldn't answer because she herself didn't know what was happening in her heart. She loved Ethan, but her relationship with Daniel felt like something she couldn't let go of. Sarah stood there, overwhelmed by emotions, looking at Ethan, whose heart was breaking with anger and pain. His eyes, blazing with resentment, could no longer hide everything that had been building inside him. All those days when he tried to believe her, when he gave her a chance, and she betrayed him again. Sarah, why can't you just be honest? His voice was like a final plea. I loved you, and I gave you a chance, but you still keep deceiving me. She lowered her head, sighing silently. Her thoughts were chaotic, and even her desire to explain everything found no release. She loved him, but her heart was still trapped in the web of her relationship with Daniel. She struggled to choose between them, unable to decide what truly mattered most to her. Ethan, I don't want to lose you. Her voice was quiet and desperate. But I can't just let go of everything. Is that so? He smirked bitterly, feeling the pain seeping through every cell of his body. You can't let go? And what about me? His words were filled with bitterness. You couldn't stay with me if you love someone else. You've destroyed everything we had. Sarah couldn't reply. Her tears finally began to fall, but her heart remained torn. She didn't know how to start fixing her mistake, as she had long since lost herself. I'm confused, Ethan, she finally said, her words hanging in the air like shattered glass. It's hard for me. I can't decide what to do. I don't have the strength. Ethan was ready to tell her to leave, for them to stop trying to repair what was already broken, but he hesitated. Something inside him wouldn't let him take that final step. He knew she was a part of his life, and even though it hurt, he wasn't ready to say goodbye. Do you want a chance? He asked, still doubting if he was doing the right thing. To start over again? Sarah lifted her head, her gaze filled with despair, but also with hope. She was willing to do anything to fix her mistakes, even if it required great sacrifice. Yes, her voice became firm. I want a chance. I want to go back to what we had. I know I've let you down, but that doesn't mean I don't love you. Ethan looked at her, unsure if he could bring himself to believe her. Every instinct told him this could be another lie. But again, there was that same weakness in his heart. He still loved her, and she was a part of his life. With all his pain, he decided to give her one more chance. I don't know if I can trust you again, he said quietly, letting out a heavy sigh. But if you're willing to change everything, we can try. But you have to be honest. Honest every step of the way. Sarah nodded, her eyes full of tears, but also determination. I will be honest. I promise. The following weeks became a test for them. Sarah tried to change her behavior, but her attempts often felt superficial. She started spending more time at home, trying to seem more involved, but sometimes Ethan noticed her gaze becoming distant again. He saw her texting someone on her phone, and her smile seemed less genuine. One evening, when Ethan came home from work, he found Sarah sitting on the couch with her phone in her hands. When she saw him, she quickly hid it in her bag, as if concealing something. Again? He asked, feeling his heart race. You still can't be honest with me? Sarah looked up, her expression changed. She began nervously looking away, unable to escape the truth. It's not what you think. Her voice was weak, but her gaze had lost its confidence. It's just old friends. I don't believe you. Ethan was resolute. He stepped closer, both hurt and enraged by her response. It's not just friends. You're still talking to him, to Daniel. I know it. Sarah raised her eyes but couldn't deny it. Her doubts about whether she could make the right choice consumed her. I don't know what to do. Her words were filled with pain. I love you, Ethan, but I can't just stop thinking about him. Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. He felt his heart breaking again. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a dismissal of everything he had tried to build. You can't love both of us? His voice turned cold, and anger flashed in his eyes. I'm not going to wait around while you figure out your feelings. Sarah tried to explain, but the words caught in her throat. She realized her choice had already been made. Ethan was no longer willing to tolerate her inaction. Ethan stood there, his face twisted with anger and disappointment, staring at Sarah, who still didn't seem to grasp the full seriousness of the situation. She was trying to find the right words, but it was all in vain. Her feelings for him, for Daniel. She was confused herself. Ethan couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer, so he decided to step outside, to breathe fresh air and calm his thoughts. Walking the dark city streets, he tried to focus, but his mind was completely consumed by her. What had he done wrong? Why couldn't he calm his emotions? This question kept spinning in his head. Suddenly, a man approached him from the side, middle-aged, wearing a dark coat with a high collar. His expression was calm, but there was a hint of mystery in his eyes. Ethan didn't immediately recognize him, though his face seemed familiar. Ethan? The voice was familiar, and after a few seconds, it clicked. It was Daniel, the same man Sarah had been messaging. You? Ethan said with disbelief, unsure of what to say. What are you doing here? Daniel smiled, ignoring Ethan's anger. Sorry if I startled you. I needed to talk to you. Ethan looked at him suspiciously. Talk? His voice was so cold it felt like the temperature had dropped around them. What, are you here to ruin my life again? No, Ethan, that's not it, Daniel replied, lowering his voice. I want to explain what happened between us. Ethan sighed, involuntarily clenching his fists. He was ready to lash out at him, but decided to let him explain. As he stayed silent, Daniel continued. You know I loved Sarah. Daniel couldn't finish the sentence because Ethan had already had enough and interrupted him. Loved? What do you mean? The anger surged through him. I was with her. She was with me. Daniel took a deep breath and lowered his head. Not exactly. I knew she was trying to choose between us, but it all started differently. She doesn't even understand that her feelings for me aren't what she thinks. I didn't mean to interfere in your relationship, but... Daniel paused briefly and looked around as if making sure no one was listening. Ethan looked at him questioningly. But what? His tone grew more distrustful. Daniel hesitated for a moment and finally said, I know who's really behind her behavior. He paused again and added, her father. Ethan shook his head, unable to believe his ears. What do you mean? How could her father be involved in this? Daniel looked him in the eye and paused again, as if deciding whether to reveal everything at once. It's a long story, but it's not as simple as it seems. Her father forced her to marry you. It was part of his plan. He wanted you to become part of his business. And Sarah? She was just a tool to achieve his goal. Ethan felt his heart tighten at what he had just heard. He couldn't believe his ears. This can't be true. Are you saying Sarah was just part of a game? His voice sounded almost defeated. Yes, Daniel replied calmly. I can't say she fully knew about it, but it was part of her life. Her father manipulated her, and even if she loves you, she was forced to go down this path. Ethan stepped back a few steps, processing the bitterness of the situation. Everything he thought he knew suddenly fell apart. The illusion of a perfect relationship with Sarah, the one he had worked so hard to build, had turned into a chain of lies and manipulation. And what am I supposed to do now? His voice became quiet, as if searching for answers in the air. How can I believe anything she says if all this was part of her father's plan? Daniel looked at him with sadness, as if understanding how difficult the question was. I don't know, Ethan, but maybe you should talk to her, understand what she really feels. Only she can give you the answers, Daniel said, stepping back. But be careful. She's already caught in a game she never wanted to play. Ethan stood silently, watching Daniel disappear into the darkness. His life seemed to have fallen into chaos, but one thing was certain. He needed to talk to Sarah. It was his only chance to figure out why she was acting this way and whether she could still be trusted. As he walked back home, Ethan felt his heart still aching from the betrayal. But now, he had a chance to uncover the truth, and he wasn't going to back down. Ethan returned home, his head filled with endless questions and a sense of betrayal that wouldn't let go. His heart raced wildly, and his mind was overwhelmed by painful thoughts about everything he had learned from Daniel. Everything he had ever believed about his relationship with Sarah now seemed like an illusion laid bare. But he needed to know more. He couldn't just leave it like this. Hours passed. Sarah still wasn't answering his calls, but he couldn't ignore her absence. Daniel increasingly seemed like a part of this game, and Ethan felt as if these two worlds were merging into one. That night, Ethan went to her house. He knew she was home, but, as usual, she was trying to avoid any conversation. "Sarah!" He knocked on the door, feeling his pulse pounding in his temples. After a few seconds, she opened the door, looking anxious but somehow cold. "What do you want, Ethan?" Her voice was quiet, but there was tension in it. Ethan looked at her with a mix of surprise and pain in his eyes. "Are you trying to run away again?" His voice was direct, as though he no longer had the strength to hide his feelings. "Why won't you tell me the truth, Sarah? Why can't you understand that all of this is a lie?" She began to realize that the fire in him had been extinguished. The hopelessness in his gaze was clear. "I don't know what you're talking about." She turned her eyes away, trying to appear calm, though her heart was racing inside. Ethan took a step closer to her, feeling his emotions spiral out of control. "You don't know? Then why, if everything was honest, didn't you tell me the truth? Why have you been lying to me from the very beginning?" His voice grew louder with anger as he stepped even closer. Sarah stepped back, but he quickly grabbed her hand, not letting her leave. "Answer me this question. It's important." He couldn't hold back the inner pain anymore. She lost her confidence again. The silence lingered for a long time before she quietly said, "You don't understand." She didn't have time to finish because the door suddenly opened and Daniel walked into the room. He looked at both of them with a cold expression, ignoring the tension in the air. "Can I interrupt?" His voice was calm but carried an undeniable force. Ethan turned to him with a look of surprise, but he was ready for anything. "What are you doing here?" His tone was now more ironic. Daniel stepped forward again, as if he were in control of the situation. "I think we all need to talk together. You, me, Sarah. This is just the beginning," he said, looking at her before adding, "You need to be with us, with both of us. You know I can give you what Ethan never could." Ethan felt his chest tighten again from the tension. Now, this wasn't just a fight for truth or feelings. It was a war, where he and Daniel were both ready to manipulate Sarah into choosing one of them. "You think I can't give her everything?" Ethan shouted, unable to hold back his emotions. "You don't know anything about us. We were together, and she knows who I am." Daniel smirked as if Ethan's words didn't matter to him, then turned to Sarah. "Don't listen to him, Sarah. All he wants is to keep you caged. I can offer you freedom, independence. You can be yourself, not tied to someone who doesn't know how to appreciate you." Sarah stood there, watching the tension between their gazes. There was a struggle in her eyes, but she didn't know whom to trust, who was truly right. Only now, as everything became clear, she started to realize that she was being manipulated, but she still wasn't ready to break free from this cycle. "I don't know who to choose." Her voice was quiet but piercing. She glanced at Daniel and then at Ethan, as if searching for an answer in their eyes. "You can stay with him and be part of his plan, or you can be with me and get everything you've ever wanted," Daniel said, trying to manipulate the situation even further. Ethan, unable to take it anymore, stepped closer to Sarah and grabbed her hand. "Don't listen to him, Sarah. I know you don't want to live in the shadow of someone else's manipulations. We can change everything. You don't have to be a part of anyone's plans." Sarah looked at both men, but her face remained unchanged, even though she felt inside that every choice seemed more difficult than the last. "I need to think," she said firmly, though it was clear she was struggling with every word. A stifling silence filled the room, and the hearts of all three seemed to beat in rhythm with the tension of the moment. Everything could change, and Sarah had to decide who truly deserved her heart. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest, each breath heavy as if she were sinking into an abyss. She was on the verge of making a choice, her mind warring with the emotions swirling within. Ethan and Daniel stood by her side, each manipulating the situation in their own way. Yet neither could see how deeply trapped she was. Sarah, you can't be with him. Ethan's voice was full of emotion, his strength and composure dissolving under the weight of the battle raging inside him. You know he just wants to use you. I need you, not him. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with pain. She had never imagined her life would turn into a struggle over a choice, over her love. But maybe Ethan was right? Or was this just another reflection of his desire to control her? Ethan, you don't understand. Her voice was almost a whisper, but she could no longer hide her doubts. I can't choose between you. I'm losing myself in this fight. Daniel stood off to the side, listening, his expression indifferent and calculating. He knew this was just a game, and he was ready to win. You're losing yourself because you're trying to please both of them, he said, his words calm, like a siren song. I'm offering you the chance not to choose between us. I'll give you what you want, freedom, the ability to be yourself without restrictions. Ethan couldn't hold back any longer and stepped toward Daniel. You think I can't give her freedom? His tone was threatening. You want her to be part of your plans, but I know who you really are. You're using her, Daniel. I just want her to be happy. Daniel smirked as if Ethan's words were just another confirmation of his own superiority. Happiness isn't what you give her, Ethan. It's what I can offer her. Don't cling to her if you're not ready to see it through. Sarah stood between them like a flooded island in a sea of raging emotions. Both men, who seemed to love her, were now fighting for her attention, trying to convince her that their way was the only right one. They were shattering her peace and leaving her trapped in this labyrinth of doubts. What do you want? Sarah asked quietly, looking at Daniel. Why should I be with you? Daniel stepped closer to her, took her hand, and his gaze became even more confident. You always want something more, Sarah. You're always looking for yourself in others, and I can give you that. You can be mine, and I'll be yours. No obligations. Just you and me. Ethan's emotions flared again. He felt his internal struggle reaching its limit. And while he knew Sarah had the right to choose, he couldn't let this go. That's not true, Sarah, he shouted, moving closer to her. You shouldn't be with him because it will destroy you. That's not freedom. It's a trap you're walking into. Sarah looked at Ethan again, her heart racing. She felt her love for him was still alive, even if she couldn't say it aloud. But what could she say? All these feelings were tangled with her fears, and she didn't know how to find a way out. I can't live under your conditions, Ethan, she said quietly, looking into his eyes. I can't be yours if you expect me to be only yours. That's not freedom. Daniel stepped closer again, his voice filled with conviction. You know I can give you what you're looking for. You have the chance to be part of my world, a world without limits. Together, we can be whoever we want to be. Ethan was overwhelmed. He felt like he was losing control but couldn't let her go. She was his. She had to be with him, and he knew that was important. The choice is yours, Sarah, he said, stepping toward her again, trying to find some answer in her eyes. I won't force you, but you have to understand that I love you, and I'm willing to do anything to make you happy. Sarah began to feel how both men were manipulating her emotions. She seemed to drown in their words, but she felt her mind starting to clear. What if she just let it all go? What if both of them were trying to trap her in their desires and ambitions? She needed time to figure it out, but every choice seemed wrong. I don't know what to do, she whispered, lowering her head. Ethan and Daniel both seemed to step toward her simultaneously, each with his plan and his goal. Now, it seemed everything hung by a thread, and Sarah was the only one who could decide who could make her happy. Sarah stood lost in her thoughts, weaving her game around the two men. She understood she was on the edge, and this game had become her only way to maintain a sense of control. She decided that her only chance to stay true to herself was to test fate and both of them. The idea of becoming a mother stirred conflicting feelings in her mind, but one thought remained undeniable. Whoever she got pregnant by would be the one to stay with her. She was sure her decision was unpredictable to everyone, even herself, but this thought became a key to her world, to her future. Ethan and Daniel had no idea what lay ahead, and this became her advantage. I think we could spend more time together, Sarah said, appearing calm, though her words carried a different undertone. She was looking for a reaction. Ethan, standing nearby, caught her gaze and frowned but didn't respond immediately. The idea made him uncomfortable, but he couldn't risk losing her. "What do you mean?" His voice was quiet, almost cautious. Sarah smiled. She knew every step, every move, every word mattered. "Just more time. Alone," she added, running her hand along his arm, but her gaze wasn't fixed on him. It was lost in her thoughts. Ethan took her words as an attempt to move forward, and it immediately caused a conflict within him. He knew she wanted to test him, but for some reason, he decided he was willing to take that risk. "I'm ready," he replied, gathering all his resolve. He understood there was no room for doubt from this moment on. He yielded to her desires, feeling he had no other choice if he wanted to keep her. As the tension between them grew, Daniel wasn't far away. He observed them closely, every move, every word. It seemed as though he was in his own world, but he couldn't ignore what was happening between them. His intuition told him that Sarah was indeed playing her game, and he wasn't ready to leave it unanswered. "Are you not afraid of her deeper intentions?" Daniel approached Ethan when he was left alone, lost in thought. His voice was calm, but his words carried a threat that was hard to ignore. "I think I know what I'm doing," Ethan replied, his voice calm but with an unspoken edge. Daniel smiled, but his eyes were cold. He realized the game was only beginning, and he had no intention of backing down. Sarah sat at home, her thoughts focused on her new plan. She had no intention of ending the game with the two men. On the contrary, she continued acting as if everything were a coincidence. Her feelings for each of them changed over time, but she couldn't make a choice. So she decided to take the biggest risk, getting pregnant, and that would be her final decision. She began spending more time with Ethan, but didn't forget Daniel. She watched how they reacted to her hints, her changing moods. She seduced both of them, and each began acting differently. Ethan became more obedient, his expression changing when she spoke, as if he was becoming even more attached to her. Daniel, on the other hand, remained colder but more cunning in his behavior. He didn't openly show his interest but couldn't leave her without his attention. "Why are you still with him?" Daniel asked when they met alone in her apartment. "I know what you want, but why are you giving it to him and not to me?" Sarah smiled, feeling the pressure intensify. "I told you, I want to see who understands me," she replied, her voice cold yet slightly manipulative. She couldn't admit that her decision had already been made. She knew exactly what she wanted, and it wasn't just physical desire. She needed to choose herself in this decision, and she decided that only the one ready for this challenge would truly become her partner. Ethan realized the game was gaining momentum. His desire to be with her grew stronger than ever, and he knew he was losing control. He didn't like it, but he couldn't stop. Once again, he approached her, watching her every move. "I can't let you go," he said one day while she sat before him, his voice filled with fear. "I know what you want from both of us, but I'm willing to do anything to stay with you. It's your choice." Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of complicated emotions. She didn't know what to do next, but she felt her plan was nearing its conclusion. She knew one of them had to choose her, and that choice would determine who would be her partner for life. Now, only one question remained. Who would take the first step toward her heart, and who would be left out of her decision? Sarah sat on the balcony, gazing at the city at night, feeling the nervous tension filling her thoughts. She still didn't know who the father of her child was. Over the past few weeks, she had spent an equal amount of time with both men. With Ethan, with whom she had a special emotional connection, and with Daniel, who was colder and more strategic in his actions. She kept this secret to herself, and it became increasingly difficult. She felt her body changing, but the inner uncertainty wouldn't leave her. Ethan had become noticeably more attentive, closely observing her every move and word. He knew there was a chance the baby might be his, but even the thought of it made him feel uncertain. His emotions were mixed. He wasn't ready for fatherhood, but at the same time, it would be proof that he meant more to her than just a man she spent time with. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't show his emotions as openly. He kept everything to himself, but his attention to Sarah never waned. He understood well that this situation could be the perfect opportunity for him, as he could become the one to truly secure her future, even if it meant resorting to complex manipulations to achieve that. She met with them, spent time with them, and gave no clear indication of who might be the father of her future child. Her plans took on the shape of a labyrinth, and even she wasn't sure if she wanted to know the answer to that question. One day, as she sat on the couch in her apartment, Ethan came over. He looked worried, his gaze fixed on her. She understood this would be a difficult conversation, but couldn't immediately grasp what it was about. "Sarah, I know something's changed. You've been acting strangely lately." His voice was softer than usual, but carried a hint of caution. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "You don't seem the same as before. Has something happened?" He sat beside her, his eyes briefly glancing at her abdomen. Sarah instantly realized he might be suspecting something, but decided not to respond directly. "I'm just tired," she said, attempting to change the subject. "It's normal. Maybe just too much stress." But Ethan didn't back down. "Sarah, I mean more than just stress. You know I'm ready to talk about anything, if you want." Sarah felt the pressure on her chest increase. She wasn't ready to reveal everything, even though she felt both of them were waiting for an answer. She couldn't just say she was pregnant because it wasn't entirely confirmed yet. She was on edge, and the feeling was overwhelming. I just don't know," she said, standing up. I'm not ready to talk about it, Ethan. I'm still thinking it over myself." She knew his question wouldn't go unanswered forever. But deep down, she also began to wonder if now was the moment to finally determine who would become the father. She was ready for any outcome because she had made this choice herself. Whether they understood it or not, it was her decision who would stay by her side. Daniel didn't wait long to make his move. That same evening, he came to her apartment. Sarah was already prepared for his arrival, and though he always appeared cold, there was something different in his gaze now. "You don't seem the same as before," he said, approaching her, his voice soft but tinged with slight dissatisfaction. "Is it because of you, or because of Ethan?" She looked at him challengingly, trying to turn the situation to her advantage. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He noticed how she was playing the game, but his own motives were clear. "I know you've made a choice, Sarah, and I know you won't tell me the truth now, but I believe you need me," he said, looking into her eyes. Sarah understood she could no longer delay her decision. And while she was at the center of this game, she had a feeling neither of them was ready for her true choice. She realized that each of them was holding on to their own version of events. And even if she didn't yet know for certain who the father was, she knew the choice was hers to make. But she wasn't ready to reveal it yet, and her plan remained a secret. She felt increasingly lost, but this secret was her decision, one she would keep until the very end. Sarah sat in the bathroom, holding a pregnancy test in her hands. The tests lay on the table, and her nerves could no longer withstand the pressure bearing down on her. She felt every part of her body trembling from uncertainty. All these weeks, she had been manipulating and keeping everything under control, but now, in this moment, everything seemed so simple and yet so difficult at the same time. She took the test, and now all she could do was wait. Her mind was swarming with thoughts about all her manipulations, all the games with Ethan and Daniel. It all came down to one simple question. Who was the father? With each passing second, Sarah became more aware that she couldn't keep playing. This was no longer just a choice between two men. This was a reality that would change her life forever. She closed her eyes and exhaled as the test finally revealed the result. She looked up and saw 2 red lines. She knew what it meant. It meant her husband, Ethan, was the father. She began to cry, but not out of joy, out of despair. She had made too many mistakes, and now those mistakes were impossible to fix. All her attempts to manipulate the situation, keeping the door open for both men, had backfired against her. A few days later, as Sarah sat in the living room of her apartment, the door opened. Ethan entered, his expression serious. He looked at her intently, and she immediately knew. He already knew. Her heart felt heavy, and she could no longer hide from him. "You know, don't you?" Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling. She couldn't meet his gaze. Ethan stared at her silently, his eyes cold but full of disappointment. He stepped closer to the table and placed something on it. "I saw the test. You can't deceive me anymore." His voice was hollow, lifeless. Sarah didn't know what to say. She had hoped Ethan wouldn't find out the truth so soon. She thought she might still be able to twist things in her favor, but it was over. Ethan, I just wanted things to be different. Her voice faltered, and she lifted her eyes, trying to find some trace of understanding in his gaze. Different? He smiled bitterly. How? How was it supposed to be different, Sarah? You manipulated me. You manipulated our marriage and our feelings. But in the end, you just got lost in your own game. Sarah felt her heart tighten. She understood that she couldn't justify herself to him, even if she desperately wanted to. All those manipulations, all those games she played, had now turned into a catastrophe. I just didn't know what to do, she said, her voice now barely audible. I was scared of losing everything. Ethan didn't respond. He just sat there, looking at her, as if struggling with his own thoughts about what to do next. Sarah, I don't know if I can forgive this. You made your choice, and I don't want to be a part of it anymore. His voice was sharp, and she knew this was his final decision. He stood up and walked to the door. I'll support the child, but we're done. I don't want to be with you anymore. Those words hit her like a hammer to the heart. Sarah stood silently, watching him leave. She couldn't say anything because she understood that deep down, it had all been decided long ago. As Ethan walked out of the apartment, Sarah was left alone with her thoughts swirling like a storm. She knew there were only two possible options left. She could go back to Daniel, try to build a new life with him, or find a way to fix things with Ethan, though that seemed impossible now. At this point, there were no illusions left. All her manipulations had led to her being alone. Ethan was leaving, and while she could still chase after him, she knew things would never be the same as they once were. And even if she stayed with Daniel, what would that be? Just another step in her endless game? Sarah started to realize that her manipulations no longer worked. Everything had changed, and now she had to deal with the consequences of her decisions. In the end, as the door closed behind Ethan, Sarah felt the tension slowly fade, leaving only emptiness and silence. She stood there, not knowing what the future held, but understanding that her life would never be the same. Could she regain what she had lost, or would she remain alone with her mistakes? Who do you think should stay with Sarah, Ethan or Daniel?